The city of Verath was not dying. It was already dead. It just hadn't figured that out yet. Kale stood on what remained of the eastern wall and watched the Vreth move through the smoke below. They didn't march. They flowed, a dark, shifting mass of carapace and limb and silence, pouring through the broken streets the way floodwater finds every crack in damaged stone. There was almost no sound from them. That was the thing that never got easier. 1,000 bodies moving through a city, and the only noise was a low vibration that came up through the soles of Kale's boots and settled in his back teeth like a bad memory. He had been fighting for 31 days. His unit had started with 44 soldiers. There were 9 of them now. Behind him, the city of Verath, capital of the Eastern Reach, home to 3 million Sauran people, seat of the Planetary Council for 400 years, was a skeleton of itself. The tall spires of the council hall still stood, but their upper floors had burned out 3 weeks ago and nothing remained but hollow stone tubes pointing at a sky turning the color of old blood. The market district was rubble. The river quarter was gone entirely. The Vreth had consumed the bridges first, then the buildings, then the people who hadn't made it to the evacuation tunnels in time. The evacuation tunnels. Kale pressed his tongue against the back of his teeth and pushed the thought away. The tunnels had been sealed 2 days ago. Orders from High Command. The Vreth had located the southern access points, and Command had decided that sealing was preferable to letting the enemy use them as corridors into the city's remaining interior. What Command had not said out loud, but what every soldier on this wall understood, was that sealing the tunnels had also trapped everyone who hadn't made it out in time. Kale had heard the sounds from below for about 6 hours after the seals went in. Then the sounds had stopped. He shifted his weight on the cracked wall parapet and checked the charge on his plasmacaster for the 4th time in the last quarter hour. 62%. The last resupply had been 9 days ago, before the orbital platforms had gone dark, before the ships stopped coming, before High Command had stopped saying the word reinforcements and started using words like consolidation and strategic realignment. Words that meant nothing was coming. The Vreth were not a species in any way Kale had been taught to understand the word. They had no home world on any Sauran record, no language, no communication channel that any Sauran xenobiologist had ever managed to decode. What they had was a hive signal, a biological frequency that coordinated every individual unit the way a brain coordinates a single hand. Each Vreth body was just a finger. The thought was somewhere else, distributed through all of them at once, and it never made a mistake twice. When the Sauran Defense Forces had collapsed the northern bridge on day 12, the Vreth hadn't retreated or regrouped. They had simply flowed around the gap, moving through the river itself, walking along the bottom like the water wasn't there, and emerged on the far bank without losing a single beat of forward motion. They didn't hold grudges, they didn't show fear, they didn't stop. They arrived and they consumed, and whatever they consumed was simply gone, and then they moved to the next thing. 17 years since first contact. 17 years since a colony ship had arrived at Drevath Station and found nothing, not wreckage, not bodies, not even the station itself. Just a biochemical trace drifting in the dark where 9,000 Sauran people had been living their lives 2 months before. 17 years of war across the outer reaches of Sauran space. 38 worlds lost. 6 allied species who had joined the Defense Pact, contributed their fleets and soldiers and resources, and been worn down until they had nothing left to offer. The Galactic Council of 12, the old alliance that had kept peace in this arm of the galaxy for 3 centuries, had held 16 emergency sessions in the last 2 years. They had passed resolutions, approved emergency funding, issued formal diplomatic condemnations of Vreth aggression to be broadcast on all standard frequencies. The Vreth had not responded to the condemnations. Footsteps behind him, Kale turned. Senna, his second in command, came up the wall steps at a steady pace. She was a compact soldier with a long scar that ran from her left jaw to the base of her throat, a gift from the Drevath relief operation 4 years back, and she had a way of walking like she was always half a step from changing direction. Her hand never fully released its grip on her rifle, even in sleep. Kale had noticed that the second week of the siege and hadn't mentioned it. "Command sent a signal," she said. "Good news." She looked at him with flat yellow eyes. "Right," he said. She handed him the data chip. He read it twice. The language was formal and clean, and said nothing that the last 31 days hadn't already communicated in a much louder voice. The Planetary Defense Council was formally acknowledging that orbital support could no longer be guaranteed. All ground units were authorized to exercise personal discretion in cases of, the document used the specific phrase, untenable defensive situations. Untenable defensive situations. Kale turned the chip over in his fingers. It was warm from Senna's pocket. "They're telling us to run," he said. "They're telling us we can run," Senna said. "There's a difference." He thought about that. He decided there wasn't. Below the wall, the Vreth had paused. That happened sometimes, a momentary stillness, like the hive mind was pausing to recalculate. Every time it happened, Kale felt the same thing settle into his chest that he imagined small prey animals felt when a very large shadow crossed over them. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. Something that predated the Sauran language's ability to name it. "Did Command say anything else?" he asked. Senna was quiet a moment. "The long-range distress signal is still broadcasting, has been since day 3. "Anyone responded?" "No." "How many civilizations are in range?" 14 that we know of." 14 civilizations. 14 species with ships and weapons and sensor arrays capable of detecting a distress beacon burning at full power. 14 different governing bodies that had presumably looked at the signal, discussed it, and decided that this was not their war. Kale handed the chip back. "Burn it." She burned it. They stood on the wall for a while without speaking. Below, the Vreth began moving again. The vibration returned to Kale's boots. In the direction of the old market district, something had caught fire, not new fire, just old fire finding new material, the city consuming itself from inside out while the Vreth consumed it from outside in. The smoke was the color of a bruise. Yev, the youngest soldier in the unit, came up the wall steps at a half-run. He was barely old enough for active service, all joints and quick eyes, and an unfired energy that the last month had not quite burned out. He had a habit of holding his breath when he was frightened. He hadn't entirely grown out of it. "Movement in Grid 7, he said. "Larger groupings than yesterday's count." "How much larger?" Kale asked. Yev told him the number. Kale absorbed it, looked at Senna. She looked at the smoke on the horizon. "We're not making it to morning," she said. "Flat, just a fact." "No," Kale said, "we're not." Yev was holding his breath. "Breathe," Kale told him. Yev breathed. Night came quickly on Vareth near the winter turn. The sun dropped and the temperature dropped with it, and the sky moved from red to deep violet to hard black in under an hour. The stars came out sharp and cold. Kale had liked the stars over Vareth his whole life. As a child, he had memorized the constellations from a book his father had given him, a physical book, the kind with real paper pages, and he could remember lying on the flat roof of his family's house in the old district, pointing at each star, saying its name. His father had tested him every clear night until he never got one wrong. The old district was rubble now. He did not look at the stars tonight. The attack came at the 3rd hour of dark, which was expected. The Vreth moved harder at night. Kale had read something in an intelligence report once about the hive's signal carrying cleaner in cold air. He didn't know if that was true. What he knew was that every major assault in 31 days had come after the sun went down. They hit the eastern wall at 4 points simultaneously. Kale's 9 held for 2 hours. That was longer than he'd expected, honestly. Yev was fast, and his aim was better than his age had any right to be. He hit things in the dark that Kale would have been satisfied to hit in full daylight. Old Marit, who was 43 and had been fighting the Vreth since the first response fleets launched after Drevath, moved through the wall's defensive positions like the architecture had been built around him specifically. He appeared exactly where pressure was breaking, never where a Vreth limb was swinging. But there were 9 of them, and the Vreth did not count their losses. They fell back to the second defensive line, then the third. The city compressed around them, block by block, the Vreth filling every space they vacated with that hive-mind silence that was somehow louder than screaming. At the 5th hour of dark, Kale's unit was inside the council hall. 38 of them should have been in the council hall. 9. They barricaded the main entry with anything that would hold weight. Kale looked around the great vaulted chamber, the high stone ceiling, the carved walls where the names of every council member going back to the founding were cut deep into the rock, the ancient mosaic floor tiles showing the first Sauran explorers reaching upward toward the sky, and thought that this was probably not the worst place for it to end. Better here than in a tunnel, better than alone in a side street. Senna was at the communication equipment in the corner of the chamber, the only working unit left after the roof array had taken damage 6 hours ago. Most of the frequencies were static. She worked through them in order, her face calm, the same expression she wore when she was cleaning a weapon or eating a meal. Senna had a gift for applying the same face to everything. "Anything?" Kale asked. "Static on all allied," she stopped. Kale looked at her. Something had crossed her face. He had not seen that expression in 31 days on this wall, not relief, not hope, something more careful than either of those things, something that was trying hard not to be wrong. "What?" he said. "There's a response on the long-range beacon." Her voice was very level. "The automatic translator is working on the designation." The room went still. Even the sounds from outside, the vibration, the low movement of the Vreth tightening around the building, seemed to step back and wait. "Response from who?" Merritt asked. "Unknown species designation." She watched the translation unit. "The signal is very close." "Close like in system?" Kale asked. "Close like," she looked at her instruments again, then looked up. "In atmosphere." Nobody spoke. Outside, the vibration in the floor had changed. Kale felt it shift pitch and then stop entirely. In 31 days, the Vreth had never gone fully still. Not under orbital fire, not when the bridges fell, not when the tunnels sealed. They were still now. Yev moved to one of the narrow windows above the barricade and looked up at the sky. He stood there without moving or speaking. "Kale," he said. Kale crossed the room and stood beside him and looked out through the narrow window. The stars were gone. Not covered by cloud, not gradually obscured, simply replaced by shapes, massive dark shapes hanging in the atmosphere blocking out the sky in a wide arc over the city. 1, 2, 4, 7, more still resolving out of the heat shimmer of their own entry burn, each one large enough to make the council hall feel like something a child had stacked from river stones. They hung there in the dark, perfectly silent, perfectly still. Then they opened. Not weapon bays, not orbital strikes. From the underbellies of those vast shapes fell thousands of smaller objects, bright on entry, slowing as they dropped, spreading across the city in lines and clusters and organized patterns that took Kale a long moment to recognize. Not falling. Landing. The translation unit chimed. Senna read the result aloud, her voice steady as rock. Message reads, "This is the Terran Expeditionary Force, 1st Contact Division, responding to distress beacon frequency Delta 7. We are deploying ground assets now. Hold your position. We have you." The chamber was silent. Kale stood at the window and watched fire fall from the sky in organized lines, and could not find a single word in any language he knew. "Who are the Terrans?" Yev said. Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Outside, the Vreth had not moved. The drop pods hit the streets of Verath like a storm that had decided to arrive all at once and be done with it. Kale watched from the window as they came in, hundreds of them, each one a burning dart trailing heat haze, slamming into the city's broken avenues and squares with concussive booms that shook the council hall's stone floor. They weren't elegant. There was no smoothness to it. Each pod hit hard and skidded and smoked and sat there for about 3 seconds, and then the panels blew outward and the things inside came out. The things inside were small. That was Kale's first coherent thought. They were small. Bipedal, 2 legs, 2 arms, 1 head, which he recognized as a functional design. The galaxy had arrived at it multiple times, but they were slight in a way that seemed wrong for soldiers. No visible armoring on the body itself. No carapace. No reinforced exoskeleton. Just soft external tissue covered in layers of material that seemed, at this range, to be little more than treated fabric. Some of them were carrying things that were clearly weapons. Others were running, already running, before their pods had fully stopped smoking. The Vreth reacted. That was the next thing Kale noted, because the Vreth reacted to almost nothing in a way that looked like surprise. They had been still for the 3 minutes since the shapes appeared in the sky. Now they began to move, and the movement was different from the smooth hive flow Kale had watched for 31 days. It was fractured. The clusters broke unevenly. Some units moved toward the landing zones. Others pulled back. For the first time since the siege of Verath began, the Vreth looked like they were making a decision instead of executing one. "They're confusing it," Senna said from behind him. She had come to the window. "The hive signal, look at the break patterns. It's not used to." "To what?" She watched the street below for a moment. "To something it doesn't already have a category for." Below the window, a cluster of Vreth units moved toward the nearest landing zone where 4 pods had come down in a tight cluster. The pods were still venting steam. The beings inside them, the Terrans, had fanned out around the pods in a formation that used the pods themselves as cover, and they were looking outward. And even from this height and distance, Kale could see that they were not panicking. He had seen a lot of beings in his 31 days of the siege. He had watched allied soldiers break and run and freeze and weep and do all the things that living creatures do when they understand they are about to die. He had done some of those things himself in his quieter moments. It was normal. It was honest. These beings did none of those things. They saw the Vreth coming, a thick mass of them, more than 100 units, the hive flowing fast now through the avenue, and they did not freeze or scatter or form a defensive circle. They moved forward. Toward the Vreth. Yev made a sound beside Kale, not a word, just a sound. The Terrans hit the Vreth formation at a run. Not chaotically, in a wedge, a tight arrowhead shape with the largest of them at the point and the others fanning behind, and they moved fast. Faster than anything that soft should have been able to move. The weapons they carried made a sound Kale had never heard before, not the clean high pitch of plasma fire, not the thudding concussion of mass drivers. Something between those two things, rapid and rhythmic, like hard rain hitting a metal roof. The Vreth front row went down. Then the second row. The wedge drove through the formation the way a blade drives through soft material, not around it, through it. And then it split, the Terrans peeling away from the center in pairs and small groups, each pair taking a different angle, spreading the Vreth's response in too many directions at once for the hive mind to optimize. Kale had been fighting the Vreth for 31 days. Before that, he had spent 4 years in various campaign zones across Sauron-held space. He had seen good soldiers fight. He knew what tactical awareness looked like from the outside, how you could read it in the way a unit moved and held angles and covered each other's positions. What he was watching below was not good soldiers fighting. It was something else. He did not yet have the word for it. "They're not stopping," Merritt said. He was at the window now too, his old voice flat and factual. Every time a unit takes a hit, they don't pull back. They close the gap. They're rotating wounded back, Senna said. You see, the ones who take hits, others close around them while they're moved back to the pods. They're shouting, Yev said. They were. Even through stone walls and 2 floors of elevation, Kale could hear it, voices loud and sharp, the Terran language, a series of hard consonants and clipped vowels that the translator unit was clearly struggling with. Not screaming, shouting, as in deliberately, communicatively shouting, to each other, across the chaos of the fight. The translator is getting fragments, Senna said, checking her unit. I'm getting numbers, directional words, and she paused, and what the translator is marking as morale-related vocalizations. What does that mean? It means she stopped again. She looked like someone trying to describe a color that didn't exist in her language. They're encouraging each other, positively, in the middle of a combat action. Kale stared at her. I know, she said. We should go out to them, Yev said. Everyone looked at him. He was 17 years old in the Soren count, and he had been holding his breath on and off all night, and he looked, right now, like he had just said something that surprised him as much as it surprised everyone else. But he didn't take it back. They came for us, he said. We should go out. Kale looked at the barricaded door, then at the window, then at the street below where the Terrans were now holding the intersection against a Vreth mass 3 times their number, and holding it without retreating a single step. He thought about the 9 of them, their charge levels, their injuries. Open the barricade, he said. Senna was already moving. They came out of the council hall's side entrance into a narrow passage that opened onto the main avenue, and the sound hit Kale immediately. A dense, layered sound. The Terran weapons and the crack of Vreth bioprojectiles, and the shouting, always the shouting, that constant voice communication cutting through everything else. The cold air smelled of burned metal and the specific biological chemical that Vreth released when their units were damaged. A Terran stopped in front of them. Kale had a moment to see her clearly. She was shorter than he was. Most of them seemed to be shorter than he was, which kept surprising him, with a face that was flat and expressive in a way Soren faces were not, and eyes that were small and set forward for depth perception rather than wide-set for field of view. She had things strapped to every surface of her body. Equipment, weapons, small devices whose purpose he couldn't immediately identify. Her expression, when she saw Kale's unit emerge from the passage, went through several things very fast: surprise, assessment, and then something that settled into what Kale could only read as relief, even though she had never met him before. She said something in her language. His translator caught the end of it. Survivors here need a count. Then she switched smoothly, without hesitation, to the galactic standard frequency, the shared language that the Council of 12 had established for cross-species contact. Her pronunciation was not good. The grammar was structural but rough, like someone who had learned from a text rather than from speaking. But it was there. How many of you? She said. 9, Kale said, including me. She nodded. The nodding was interesting, a Soren gesture too, head motion for affirmation. He had not expected that. Armed. Yes. Good, I'm Vasquez. First Contact Division, Terran Expeditionary. You're the distress beacon. We are. Another Terran arrived at her shoulder, larger, with what seemed to be greater quantity of equipment, speaking rapid Terran to her. She responded without taking her eyes off Kale. Then back to him. Can your unit fight? We've been fighting for 31 days, Kale said. Something moved across her face. He didn't know the Terran face well enough yet to name it. Then you know this city. I know it better than anything still alive. She looked at him for 1 second. Good, stay on my left, tell me what I'm looking at. She turned back toward the fight before he could respond, and Kale found himself moving after her because the alternative was standing still. And standing still was not something Senna or Marit or Yev needed to see him do. They fell into the Terran formation, or the formation absorbed them, which was closer to accurate. The Terrans adjusted their spacing and angles without being told, creating positions for Kale's 9 without breaking their own pattern, and Kale had spent long enough fighting alongside allied species to know how rare that was. Coordination under fire with an unknown unit usually took planning, usually took time. These beings did it like breathing. At the far end of the avenue, the Vreth had massed again. The hive was learning, adapting its flow patterns to account for the Terran wedge tactic, spreading wider, trying to extend past the flanks. Kale had watched it do this for a month. Every tactic the Soran forces had used, the hive had adapted to within 2 engagements. Vasquez was watching it too. He could see it in how her small forward-set eyes moved across the mass, reading it, categorizing it. She said 3 words in Terran to the unit, and they shifted before Kale even processed that a shift had been called. "It's going to flank left," Kale told her. "It always." "Already see it," she said, then almost to herself. "So it learns fast, okay." She didn't sound worried. She said okay, the way someone says it when they've just been told the problem is harder than expected and have decided that's fine. Kale did not know what to do with that. The Vreth flank came fast, 300 units spilling around the left edge of the avenue, moving to wrap around the Terran formation's rear. Vasquez did not pull back. She pulled the formation into a tighter shape, opened the left side deliberately, made a gap. And when the first Vreth units poured into it, 12 Terrans who had been waiting in the side alleys closed in from 3 angles at once. The Vreth units that had entered the gap were gone in under a minute. "They made a hole," Yev breathed. He was right beside Kale, his rifle up, his breathing finally even. "They made a hole on purpose." "Yes," Kale said. Yev searched for the right word. Kale didn't have it either. The night was loud and cold and the city was still burning in pieces around them, but the Vreth mass, for the first time in 31 days, was not moving forward. It was trying to. Kale could see it trying. But the Terrans were everywhere in its path, and every time the hive mind found an opening, there were Terrans in it already, moving like they had read the thought before it finished. A Terran soldier went down 30 meters ahead of them, hit by something, hard, rolling to the side of the avenue. 2 others were there before he stopped moving. They grabbed him and pulled him back, and one of them took his position while the other checked him, and the line held. Kale watched this happen, processed it. The Terran who had been hit was being checked now, alive, moving, arguing back at the one treating him. The one treating him was responding, and even through the language barrier Kale could read the tone. "Hold still. Stop talking, I'm working." The wounded Terran was, apparently, trying to argue about it. "They protect their wounded," Senna said. "Most species do," Kale answered. "No, they protect them and then they get them back into the fight." She was watching the pair now. The wounded Terran had been given something, an injection, and was sitting up, then standing. "Watch." The wounded Terran picked up his weapon, tested his own arm, looked at the line, walked back to it, took a position. He had been down for 4 minutes. Kale stood in the middle of a battle he had expected to die in 2 hours ago, and watched a being he had not known existed this morning walk back into a fight with a fresh injury, and take up a defensive position without being told to. For the 3rd time that night, he did not have a word. Vasquez appeared at his shoulder. "What's the most defensible structure in this district?" "Council Hall," Kale said. "Behind us, stone construction, multiple levels." "Can we anchor a line there and clear outward?" "Yes, I know every room." She looked at him, those small, forward-facing eyes. "Then take me inside," she said, "and tell me everything." Kale looked back at the hall, at the mosaic floor and the carved walls, and the names of 400 years of council members, and the ancient image of the first Sauran people reaching for the sky, and thought that the building had never been used for exactly this purpose. Then he thought it probably should have been. "Follow me," he said. There was a moment, maybe 20 minutes into working with the Terrans, when Kale stopped thinking of them as small. He didn't decide to stop. It just happened. The way your eyes stop noticing background detail because the foreground keeps demanding attention. The Terrans were technically smaller than a Sauran soldier in nearly every physical dimension that could be measured. They had less natural armor. Their sensory organs were concentrated in a small zone on the front of their heads, which should have made them easier to flank. They needed to consume mass quantities of water regularly or their performance degraded. They functioned poorly in extreme temperature ranges. The xenobiological profile that Kale had received in his basic training as a young recruit, one paragraph on Terrans, listed under lesser-known contacted species, had described them as *moderate in physical capability, high in technological development, limited in direct combat application. Whoever had written that had never seen one fight. Vasquez had commandeered the top floor of the council hall's east wing within 12 minutes of entering the building. Not requested it, not discussed it. She had looked at the floor plan Kale sketched for her in the dust of a broken wall, pointed at the east wing, said 3 words in Terran and 4 words in rough Galactic Standard. This one, sight lines best, and her soldiers had moved before she finished speaking. She had established a command position with overlapping fields of view in all directions. She had assigned 4 Terrans to run communication, using devices Kale didn't recognize, speaking in fast Terran, coordinating with other units apparently spread across multiple districts of the city. She had done all of this while simultaneously discussing with Kale the precise layout of every major avenue in the central district, absorbing information at a pace that kept making him repeat himself because he assumed she'd missed something. She never missed anything. By the 3rd hour of the night, 2 hours after the pods had landed, Kale had learned several things about Commander Vasquez and the Terrans more generally. First, they did not stop talking. In any other species military unit Kale had ever encountered, combat produced silence or screaming. Orders were given, acknowledged, executed. The Terrans did something else. They maintained a constant low voice presence even in the middle of active fire, not orders exactly, more like a running commentary they were sharing with each other. Positions, assessments, warnings. Sometimes what sounded, through the translator, like dark jokes. The commentary never stopped. It was the background frequency of everything they did. Second, they made decisions very fast and changed them even faster. The Vreth hive mind adapted to tactics across 2 or 3 engagements. Vasquez adapted within the same engagement. If something stopped working, she moved to something else before the Vreth had finished processing that it had worked. She did not appear to need to think about this. The adaptations arrived the way breathing arrived, necessary, automatic, uninterrupted. Third, they had a different relationship to their own damage than anything Kale had observed before. He saw this clearly at the 4th hour. A Terran named Cole Vasquez called him by name. She called all of them by name, constantly, was holding a position at the hall's north entrance when a Vreth unit got through a gap and hit him from the side. Cole went down hard against the wall, came up with his left arm hanging wrong, a dislocation, from the angle of it, the kind of damage that ended a Sauran soldier's effectiveness for the rest of an engagement. Cole looked at his arm. Then he looked at the Vreth that had hit him, which had not retreated and was moving in for the next strike. Then he said something in Terran that the translator rendered as an expression of strong negative emotion. The exact phrasing was apparently beyond the current calibration, and he swung the displaced arm against the wall beside him. The shoulder relocated with an audible impact. Cole made a short, sharp sound that was clearly pain. Then he raised the weapon in that arm and shot the Vreth unit 3 times and went back to holding his position. Kale had seen this happen from 15 meters away. He stood there for a moment, and his brain did the thing brains do when they receive information that does not fit the existing framework. It simply failed to process it and moved on, because processing it fully would take more time than the situation allowed. Senna appeared at his shoulder. "Tell me you saw that," she said. "I saw it," Kale said. "I am going to be thinking about that for the rest of my life. However long that turns out to be," Kale said. Senna's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, longer than this morning's estimate. She wasn't wrong. The shape of the fight had changed in ways that Kale's 31 days had not prepared him for. The Vreth were still out there in mass numbers. The city was not retaken, was nowhere close to retaken, but the hive mind's forward movement had stopped. For the first time since the siege began, the pressure was not inward. The city's corpse was holding. The Terrans had not won anything yet, but they had installed themselves into the city's ruin like load-bearing columns into a damaged structure, and the ruin was still standing. Old Merritt found Kale around the 5th hour, when the main action had shifted to the western districts, and the hall itself was temporarily in a pocket of relative quiet. Merritt sat down on a piece of broken wall with the careful movement of a man who knew how much his body had left in it, and he looked out at the avenue below where a Terran squad was reloading and checking equipment, with the brisk efficiency of beings who expected to be moving again soon. "I've been fighting the Vreth since Drevath," Merritt said. "I know," Kale said. "I've fought alongside the Keth, the Sorvak, the Drayan." He named 3 species that had been part of the old defense pact, all 3 home worlds lost. "I've seen good fighters. I've seen what courage looks like in 12 different body configurations." Kale waited. "These things are different," Merritt said. He wasn't asking anything. He was putting words to something he'd been sitting with for the last several hours, turning it over and over, trying to find the edges of it. "It's not that they're faster. It's not that their weapons are better. The Vreth has faced better weapons." "Then what?" Kale asked. Merritt was quiet for a moment. "The Vreth learns by finding the pattern. Every species has a pattern. When you understand what a species is afraid of, what they'll pull back from, you can run a hive mind against them forever because you always know where the line is." He looked at the Terran squad below. "These ones. I cannot find where the line is." Kale had been thinking something similar for hours. He hadn't put it into words yet. "They should have a line," Merritt said. "Everything has a line." Below, Vasquez had come back down from the upper floor and was talking to the squad in the avenue. She was pointing at the map they had drawn together on the wall upstairs, then at 2 specific streets. The squad was nodding. Then they were moving. Vasquez walked beside them for 12 steps and then peeled off to the right, going somewhere else, already working the next problem. Yev came sprinting up the hall steps, breathing hard, his face bright with something that was either terror or exhilaration, and at that pace might have been both at once. "They found the access tunnel to the water infrastructure," he said. "The Terran, Vasquez, she's sending a unit through it to come up under the Vreth concentration in the old market district. She said." He stopped and organized the translation in his head. "She said it will take the hive mind 3 minutes to respond to a threat from below." She said 3 minutes is enough. "Enough for what?" Kale asked. "To break their concentration in the eastern quarter and open a corridor to the outer wall." Kale stared at him. The water infrastructure tunnel network ran under the entire city. Kale knew it existed. He had grown up in this city, had known about those tunnels his entire life, and had never once thought about running soldiers through them. "She's been here 6 hours, Senna said. "Yes," Kale said. "She's been here 6 hours, Senna repeated, as if volume would make it more or less strange. The tunnel operation unfolded over the next 40 minutes, and Kale watched from a high window in the council hall as the result of it moved across the eastern quarter like a wave. The Vreth concentration near the old market, which had been a fixed mass for 8 days. A heavy anchoring point for the entire hive presence in that sector, suddenly splintered as something hit it from underneath. The Terrans in the tunnels had found the central cavity beneath the market's foundation, come up through 3 access points simultaneously, and were inside the Vreth concentration before it registered the threat. The hive mind did what it did. It adapted, redirected, tried to contain. But by the time the containment response arrived, the Terrans were already through and moving. They didn't hold the position. They had never intended to hold it. They had moved through it, disrupted it, and come out the far side into the corridor Vasquez had needed. The eastern quarter's Vreth presence, deprived of its anchor, began to drift. And drifting Vreth whose hive signal coordination was stretched and confused, died faster than Vreth with clear direction. Kale had never seen the Vreth drift. He had been told it was possible. In the same intelligence report that had described hive signal cold weather performance, there had been a single paragraph noting that severe disruption to multiple simultaneous coordination points could produce localized hive confusion, an effect that dissipated in 10 to 15 minutes as the signal reestablished. He had read it once and filed it in the part of his mind labeled asterisk theoretically true, operationally irrelevant. It was not irrelevant anymore. Vasquez appeared in the doorway behind him. She had blood on the left side of her jacket, not hers. The color and chemical smell of it was Vreth, and she was eating something from a small package with her free hand. She looked at where he was looking, out the window at the eastern quarter's change in pattern. "It's working," he said. "Yeah." She tore another piece from the package. 40 minutes before the hive stabilizes and re-anchors. I want the outer wall corridor secured in 30. That's not much time. That's enough time. She said it the same way she had said asterisk okay asterisk earlier, when he told her the Vreth adapted fast. Like difficulty was a thing she filed in a different folder than impossibility, and nothing had yet made it into the second folder. She offered him a piece of whatever she was eating. He looked at it. It smelled like something had happened to it chemically, and then someone had added a great deal of salt. He took it anyway, because 31 days of siege rations had eliminated most of his preferences. It was terrible. He ate the rest of it anyway. His body needed the mass. "Your soldiers," he said, "how long have they been deployed?" "This unit, 18 months out." She finished the package and looked around for somewhere to put it, didn't find anywhere and put it in a pocket. Rotated through 4 contact zones before this one. "How long has your species been fighting?" She looked at him, and her forward-facing eyes did something, a narrowing at the outer corners that he was starting to read, in context, as amusement. "Which war?" she said. He did not know what to say to that. "We've been fighting each other since before we left our home system," she said, not with pride, not with shame, just factual, the way someone describes the weather of the place they grew up. "When we got out into the wider galaxy and found there were things out here that wanted to eat planets," she paused. It felt familiar. Kale absorbed this, set it aside. There was no immediate use for it in the next 30 minutes, and he had learned, in 31 days of surviving, to ruthlessly defer everything that didn't have immediate use. "The outer wall corridor," he said. "I know a route." "Then walk with me," she said. She was already at the door. He walked with her. The corridor to the outer wall lasted 23 minutes before it almost failed completely. It had been going well, which was probably what made the failure so hard. The eastern quarter's Vreth concentration was still fractured from the tunnel operation, and Vasquez had moved 3 squads through the gap with Kale's unit embedded alongside them, pushing hard for the outer wall before the hive could anchor and reclose. They had covered 2/3 of the distance with contact, but manageable contact. The kind where you move and shoot and don't stop, and the numbers stay in your favor. Then the hive re-anchored. Kale felt it before he saw it. The same thing that had been in his boots for 31 days, the low vibration of coordinated Vreth mass movement, but now coming from 2 directions at once. In front, where the outer wall was still 100 meters away, and behind, where the gap they had moved through was being sealed by a fresh Vreth concentration flowing in from the northern districts. They were enclosed. a corridor becoming a box. Vasquez called it before anyone else did. 3 Terran words that Kale's translator caught as asterisk close it in, a shorthand that meant something precise to her soldiers because they immediately shifted. The formation compressed, the squads pulling tighter together, establishing a perimeter that was now facing in all directions rather than forward. The outer wall was right there, 100 meters. But the breath ahead had thickened, and the breath behind had thickened, and what had been a manageable situation 30 seconds ago was now the kind of situation that Kale had spent 31 days watching end in one specific way. He looked at his unit. Senna was steady. She was always steady. It was the only way he knew how to read her. Merritt had that stillness that meant he was conserving everything. Yev's breathing was controlled, which was something, which was progress from where they'd started 3 hours ago. 40% charge on Kale's plasma caster, less for some of the others. The breath ahead were maybe 40 seconds from contact range. Vasquez was on her communication device, the short-range one, speaking fast Terran in a voice that was clipped but not raised, and Kale caught fragments from the translator. Pinned at outer wall corridor, need fire support, eastern approach, and a set of coordinates he didn't recognize, and then a short response in another Terran voice, and then Vasquez saying one word in Terran that his translator rendered as asterisk acknowledged. She ended the communication and looked around the perimeter. 2 minutes, she said in Galactic Standard, to Kale specifically. 2 minutes for what? He asked. She looked at the sky. He looked at the sky. It was still mostly dark, the false dawn of a Vareth winter just beginning to touch the eastern edge, and the shapes of the Terran ships were visible as darker patches of dark against the black. Still huge. Still so large they redefined what the word large asterisk meant. One of them had moved. He hadn't noticed it moving, but it had shifted position and was now directly above the northern district, and as he watched, something on its underbelly began to glow, a deep red that deepened toward orange, like a coal being breathed to life. Hold positions, Vasquez said, to everyone, Terran and Soren alike. Kale looked at the breath concentration ahead of them. It was moving. It was inside 20 seconds now. That's very close, he started. The ship fired. Not at them. At the northern district, at the breath concentration that had closed behind them, sealing the box. The shot did not look the way weapons fire usually looked. It was not a beam or a bolt or a projectile with a trajectory. It was a column of concentrated energy that simply went from the ship to the ground, and where it touched, the ground and everything on it was not there anymore. The noise arrived half a second later. It was not a sound. It was a pressure change, the kind that Kale had experienced at the edge of the training range when the heavy weapons were tested, the kind that hit the chest from the inside rather than the outside. The breath concentration behind them was gone, not scattered, not driven back. Gone. The formation held its position for 2 seconds of total silence. Then Vasquez said, in Terran, the word that came through the translator as asterisk move, and the formation was moving, and the 100 meters to the outer wall was covering itself under their boots, and the breath ahead had broken formation, shattered. The hive signal obviously disrupted by the sudden absence of an entire coordinated mass. And they were through. They were at the wall, and then they were past it, and in the cleared outer zone and alive. Kale stood at the outer wall and breathed. Just breathed. Let his respiratory system have the moment it needed without interference. Yev sat down on a chunk of broken outer wall stone, elbows on knees, head down. Not injured, just recalibrating his entire understanding of what was possible. Merritt stood with his arms at his sides and looked back at the city. They called a ship, he said. They called a ship to fire a support shot in an urban engagement. He wasn't outraged. He was awed. The precision required to. The crew's been running these shots for 8 months, Vasquez said, catching the end of it. She had come to stand beside Kale, slightly winded but functional. Before that, training. Before that, simulations. She looked up at the ship. Orion crew is good. You trust them, Kale said. With my life. She said it without looking at him, which I just did. Kale thought about what kind of fighting force developed that. 8 months of live operations, training before that, simulations before that. Not just the infantry, also the crews in those vast ships overhead, calibrating weapons for precision support in confined urban environments. A whole system designed around one premise, which seemed to be, nobody gets left. He thought about the 9 of them. 11 Soren soldiers who had not made it to the council hall, 35 who had not made it past day 20, 44 who had started. How many did you lose, he asked, in your units tonight? Vasquez was quiet for a moment. 6 confirmed, 4 more being assessed. Her voice was level, but it was the kind of level that was being maintained deliberately, the way you maintain a level surface by doing invisible work underneath it. We'll know in an hour. I'm sorry, Kale said. She looked at him, the narrow eye thing again, not amusement this time. This is what we do, she said, and there was something in her voice then, not the tactical calm, not the professional steadiness, something that sat underneath those things and was heavier. The thing you carry when you've been doing this long enough to know exactly what you're carrying. She didn't say anything else about it. The outer wall zone was large, a wide cleared space that had been the city's defensive buffer before the siege began, and was now a staging area for the Terran operation. Drop pods were clustered here in groups, some of them being used as supply points, others as temporary medical stations. Terran soldiers were moving in and out of the city through 4 different breach points, and even from here Kale could see that the operation had not slowed. Reinforcements were arriving by a second wave of drops. He could see fresh burn trails in the sky where new pods had come in, and the movement of the whole operation had the quality of something that was still accelerating. 2 hours into a first contact scenario, a species they had never engaged with before. Still accelerating. How did you know to come? Kale asked. Vasquez looked at him. The distress beacon, 14 civilizations in range. No one else responded. Why did you? She was quiet for a moment. Then, because you sent a distress beacon, because that means you needed help and there wasn't none coming. Her galactic standard grammar was rough, but the sentence was perfectly clear. Your governing body approved it, Kale said. A first contact response to an unknown beacon from an unknown species in an active Vreth engagement zone. Our first contact division has standing authorization to respond to distress signals without case-by-case approval. She said it simply. We wrote that into the charter after the first time a signal came in and got held up in committee for 3 weeks while the species sending it ran out of time. She looked at the city. We lost a lot of worlds before we learned to move first and discuss after. Kale absorbed that. It described a species that had been given, by its own painful history, exactly the lessons needed to fight this specific kind of war. The Vreth, he said, you've encountered them before. Different designation in our records. What you call Vreth, we call the stream. Ran into them in the Kepler sectors about 12 years ago. What happened? We lost 3 colony ships, then we studied the stream for 4 years, then we fought them back out of Kepler sector. She said it without inflection. Win, loss, study, win, just events on a list. 4 years, Kale said. He did not say what he was thinking, which was that the Soren had been fighting for 17 and had not driven the Vreth back from a single occupied system. She seemed to hear the unspoken part. You were fighting alone, she said, and your doctrine was defensive. You held and fell back and held and fell back. Not critical, just observational. The Vreth is a forward system. It doesn't optimize for contested space. It optimizes for consumed space. You hold it in contested space and it gets confused. Is that what you're doing, holding it contested? Tonight, in the short term. She turned to face him fully. In the growing light of the false dawn, he could see her face more clearly than he had all night. She looked tired, not broken, not close to breaking, just the ordinary fatigue of a human body that had been at full output for many hours. Tomorrow we're going to push it back. Day after that, we're going to push it back further. We're going to make it very uncomfortable to be the Vreth in this sector. You have enough units for that. Getting more by the hour. She glanced at the sky, at the drop trails, and you have something we don't. 9 soldiers and 40% charge. You have 31 days of knowing this city, how the Vreth moves through it, where it anchors, what it avoids. She said it like these things had value, like they were assets she was cataloging. That knowledge is worth more than an extra battalion. Kale looked at his unit. Senna, checking her weapon, she always checked her weapon. Merritt, still standing at the wall, looking back at the city with the expression of a person tallying things. Yev, who had stood up from the rubble and was watching the Terran soldiers move and had, somewhere in the last hour, stopped looking frightened. Not rested, not safe, still in a city that was largely occupied by something that had been consuming worlds for 17 years. But standing. All 9 of them still standing. You came for a distress signal from a species you didn't know, Kale said, into a combat zone that was clearly failing, without prior engagement, intel, or allied support. Yes, Vasquez said. Why? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something in Terran first, 4 words, almost to herself before translating. Because if we don't, who does? It was not a rhetorical question. He could hear that. It was the premise her entire operation was built on, stated simply, and she had clearly stopped expecting an answer because the silence between species was where the answer usually lived. Behind them, the city was fighting again. The sounds of it carried over the wall in the cold morning air. The Terrans were in there, doing what they'd been doing all night, and the Vreth, for the first time, were not moving forward. For the first time in 31 days, the city of Verath was not getting smaller. Kale checked his charge. 40%, he looked at Senna. She was already looking at him. He tilted his head toward the breach point in the wall, the passage back into the city, back into the fight. She nodded, tapped Merritt. Merritt tapped Yev. The 9 of them formed up without being asked. Vasquez looked at them. Something in her face settled. On me, she said. They went back in. The Vreth left Verath at dawn on the 33rd day. Not defeated. Kale understood that. He had fought them long enough to know that defeated was not a category that applied to the Vreth the way it applied to beings with self-preservation instinct and command structures that could break. The Vreth did not surrender. They did not negotiate withdrawal. What they did was reach a calculation, somewhere in the distributed intelligence of the hive signal, that this territory was no longer viable for consumption. That the cost of forward movement had exceeded the return. And when the hive reached that calculation, it simply reversed. They moved out of Verath the same way they had moved in. Flowing. Quiet. No retreat signal, no organized rearguard, no acknowledgement that they had been fought. They just reversed course, and the low vibration that had lived in Kale's boots for 33 days began to fade, and within 3 hours the streets of the city were the Vreth's empty wake, rubble and silence, and the smell of their biological chemistry still hanging in the cold air. The Terrans did not celebrate when the Vreth pulled back. Kale had expected something. Not a party, not a ceremonial moment, but something, the species-specific release that he had seen in his own soldiers after a hard fight, the noise and movement and physical expression of relief. The Keth did it in a specific call-and-response sequence that their units ran through after every engagement. The Sorvak touched their foreheads to the ground for 30 seconds, which Kale had always found moving even as an outsider. Even Sauron's soldiers had a version of it, the lowering of weapons, the slow exhalation, the checking of who was still there. The Terrans, when the Vreth pullback became clear, went quiet. Not still. They kept moving, securing positions, establishing perimeter, triaging their wounded, running communication back to the ships. The operational efficiency didn't stop, but the voice noise, the constant low communication that had been the background frequency of everything they did for the last 2 days, dropped away. They moved through the changed city in something that Kale could only call silence in motion, and it took him a long time to understand what he was watching. They were counting. Not inventory, not territory, who was there and who was not. He watched it happen in Vasquez's unit, the squads coming back in from their positions and finding each other, the physical contact between them, the hands on shoulders and arms, the checking. The Terrans touched each other a lot. He had noticed it during the fight as well, had filed it as a coordination behavior, but it was something else. The touch was not tactical. It was the opposite of tactical. It was personal, a specific being confirming to another specific being that they were present, intact, real. Cole was there, his shoulder receded by its own impact against a wall, his arm in a temporary brace that he had clearly applied to himself with one hand, and that Kale was fairly sure was not medically correct, but was functioning. He found the soldier he'd been paired with for most of the night and did the hand-on-shoulder thing, and said something in Terran that the translator caught as *we good, and the other soldier said something back, and then they both turned outward to the work again. But the moment was there, it had been there, real. And some of them came back and the person they looked for was not there, and the touch and confirm had a different shape in those cases, longer, still, and then moving forward anyway. Vasquez was standing near the council hall's main entrance when Kale found her. She was looking at the names carved into the outer wall, the council member names he had grown up seeing, the ones he had stopped reading sometime around day 15, when reading them had started to feel like looking at a list of things the city would not recover. She couldn't read Sauron script, but she was looking at it anyway, and her expression was the one he had been trying to name since first contact. The one underneath the operational efficiency, the one that was heavier. "We lost 9, she said without turning. "Confirmed now." Kale stood beside her, calculated the proportion, 9 from a force of several hundred deployed in his sector alone, 2 days of intensive engagement against the Vreth in a contested urban zone. As a tactical number, it was a result that Sauron military doctrine would have classified as outstanding. As a number to carry, it was 9 specific beings. "Who were they?" he asked. She looked at him, not surprised, maybe not surprised. "Why?" "Because you came here for us. I want to know who paid for that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said their names, all 9, each one with a rank and a home region on their world and a small detail, not a full sentence, just a fragment, the kind of information that placed a being inside a specific life. One had 2 children. One had been scheduled for rotation home in 6 weeks. One had enlisted specifically for First Contact Division because she had believed. Vasquez's voice did something very slight on this one, almost nothing. That making first contact with new species was the most important job a soldier could do. Kale listened to all 9 names. When she finished, they stood in silence for a while. "Do you have a specific morning practice?" he asked. "Several," she looked at the wall. "Different soldiers do it differently. We give them time for that, later. But first you count." "First we count," she turned from the wall, "and then we work because there's still work." There was still work. The Vreth had left Vareth but had not left the planet, had not left the system. The ships in orbit were tracking the hive mass as it moved toward the outer settlements, the smaller population centers, less defensible. The Terran force would follow. The operation was not over. Kale's 9 had become 8. They had lost Ren in the corridor push, not in the tight moment that had nearly closed on them, but an hour later in the Western District clearance, a Vreth unit that had been playing dead. It was the oldest trick and Ren had known better and had still turned his back for 2 seconds. 2 seconds was what it cost. Kale had not let himself sit with it yet. He'd been filing it with all the other things he was not letting himself sit with. 33 days of compressed grief stacked in an orderly row at the back of his mind, waiting. "Your species," Vasquez said. "How long has your war been?" 17 years. "How many worlds lost?" 38 confirmed, 3 more whose current status we can't verify. She processed this. He watched her do it the way she held information still and looked at it. "Alone," she said. "The Allied Pact, 6 species, but they've exhausted their resources." "Have they?" She didn't phrase it as a question. She was making a note somewhere, maybe literally. She had a small device she used for this, and her voice had the quality of someone adding an item to a list that was already very long. "First contact will want to make contact with all 6. "For what purpose?" "For the same purpose." She glanced at him briefly. "You found us. They haven't yet, or their signals didn't reach us. Either way, if they're still fighting, they should know we're out here." Kale stood with this, tried to see the shape of it. A species that received distress signals and responded as a matter of institutional policy. That had learned this lesson painfully enough to encode it permanently into their doctrine. That was, right now, making a note to find 6 other exhausted species and make contact. "How many are you?" he asked. "Terrans." "Yes." "Counting military," she thought for a moment. "Active duty, reserve, and auxiliary, about 400 million, spread across our colonial system." 400 million. Kale's world had fielded, at the height of its capacity, 12 million active soldiers. "How many worlds do you hold?" he asked. "About 40. Active settlement, more in various stages of development." "And your home world?" "Earth." She said the word in Terran, not translated a proper name specific and owned. "Yes." "Do you fear for it? The Vreth, the stream, if they ever reached Earth?" "They won't." She said it without hesitation. Not as bravado. Not as a statement of confidence that required support. Just a fact, the same way she had said "we have you" in that first transmission, before she had landed, before she knew what she was landing into. "We have you." Kale thought about those words. Had been thinking about them, he realized, since Senna had read them aloud in the council hall. The simplicity of them. The completeness. Not "we are sending support" or "we will assess the situation" or * pending council approval. 3 words that took the entire weight of the unknown situation and set it down somewhere else. "We have you." His father had said something like that to him once, after a bad dream. Kale had been very young and the dream had been a child's dream, dramatic and formless, and his father had come to his room and sat on the edge of his sleeping mat and said something in the old household dialect that meant roughly the same thing. "I have you. You're not alone in it." He had not thought of that memory in years. He thought of it now, standing in the ruins of the city he had grown up in, next to a being from 40 light-years away who had come because a signal asked. The sun was fully up now. Verath's winter sun, pale and distant but real. It came over the eastern ruins and lit the broken stone of the avenues and the smoke still drifting from a dozen fires and the carved wall of the council hall with its 400 years of names. Kale squinted against it. "What happens now?" he said. "For your forces, for mine." "Your forces fold into the combined operation while we push the Vreth back from your planet. After that, if your government wants to continue, formalize things, we open a treaty discussion. There's a standard framework for it. Usually takes a few months." She paused. "Or years, depends on the species." "What does the treaty give us?" She looked at him, and her forward-facing eyes had something in them that he was, by now, well enough calibrated to read. "Partners," she said. It was not a complex word. It described something very simple. And yet he found he could not quite locate the right size of response for it, because the word *partners implied a thing that the Sauron had not had, not really, not in the form that word contained, in 17 years of trying to fight alone. The Allied Pact had been resources and soldiers shared between exhausted parties. This was something else. This was a species that was not exhausted, that had been through its own long dark version of what the Sauron were still inside, and had come through it, and had encoded respond to distress signals into the DNA of its military doctrine, and had 400 million people under arms, and had asked the Vreth to be uncomfortable in occupied territory, and had meant it. Partners. Old Marit materialized at Kale's shoulder, which he did sometimes, appeared at the elbow without detectable transit, like the ruined city was just a series of rooms he moved between invisibly. He stood there a moment, looking at the Terran activity in the avenue below the hall. "I've been thinking about what I said last night," Marit said, "about not finding the line." "What about it?" Kale said. "I think I understand it now." He watched a Terran squad moving into position in the avenue, fast, organized, already oriented on the next task. The line for a species is the thing they won't come back from, the thing that breaks the pattern. He was quiet for a moment. "These ones have been broken many times. They broke each other. For a long time, from what I gather, they were the worst thing they themselves had to fear." He said it without judgment, just information. When you've been broken by the worst thing and come back, the next thing that tries to break you, he let it sit there. "It just doesn't find purchase," Senna said. She had appeared on the other side, which was typical. When Marit materialized, Senna was never far behind. There's no shape for it to grab. Below, Vasquez was moving again. She had found one of her lieutenants and they were bent over a map together, her finger tracing routes, her voice clipped and directional. The operation was spinning up for the next phase. The moment of stillness, of counting, of nomming was done. The work was resuming. Yev came out of the council hall behind them, eating something from a pouch that one of the Terrans had given him. He had the look of someone who had been awake for 36 hours and was running on whatever the Terrans had offered him, which Kale suspected was either very good or very terrible and possibly both. He stood beside Kale and looked out at the city. "We're going to take it back," Yev said. "Not a question." "Yes," Kale said. "All of it." Kale looked at the city, the ruins of the market district, the burned spires of the council hall, the old district where his father had given him a book about stars and tested him on the names every clear night, the river quarter, the bridges. "Probably not all of it," he said. "Not this city, not the way it was." He paused, "but enough." Yev was quiet for a moment, eating. Then, "The Terran medic who bandaged my shoulder this morning. She said something to me that the translator took a while to render." "What did she say?" "She said," he thought about it, "she said that she had heard the Sauron were stubborn fighters, and that she had heard right." Kale looked at him, at the kid who had been holding his breath on a dying wall 2 nights ago, who was now eating alien ration food in the pale winter sun with a bandaged shoulder and steady eyes. "What did you say back?" Yev shrugged. "I said I hadn't heard anything about Terrans before last night." He took another bite. "And that now I had." In the avenue below, Vasquez looked up briefly at the wall at them. The narrow-eyed thing. Whatever it meant when it was not amusement. Something close to it, maybe. Something in the same country. She turned back to her map. The city of Varath was not saved. Not yet. It was a ruin with a temporary hold inside it and a Vreth mass still on the outer edges and 33 days of damage that would take years to count properly. The planet was still contested. The system was still contested. 38 worlds were still gone. 6 allied species were still exhausted in the dark. But the sky was open. And it was full of ships that had come because someone had asked. And 9 soldiers ate now because of Ren, and that sat in Kale's chest where it would sit for a long time, were standing in the pale winter sun of a planet that was still there. And the vibration had left his boots, and the stars over Varath, when darkness came again, would not be covered by shapes that meant death. They would be covered by shapes that had come for them. Kale picked up his plasmacaster, checked the charge, walked down from the wall. There was still work.